Eliot Hayes took a deep breath, his fingers lightly tightening around the handle of his small, well-worn suitcase as he stepped into the vast, gleaming airport terminal. The polished floors reflected the bright overhead lights, and the air was filled with the hum of rolling suitcases, distant announcements, and hurried conversations. It was the sound of people coming and going, each with their own destinations, their own stories. And today, Eliot was part of it, not just as another traveler, but as someone who had earned his place in this moment. At 17 years old, Eliot had always been a quiet, thoughtful young man. He was intelligent, not just in the way of books and tests, but in the way he observed the world, seeing things others often missed. His dark eyes, sharp yet warm, hid behind thin-rimmed glasses, and his neatly kept curls framed his face in a way that made him appear both composed and endlessly curious. But today, despite his calm demeanor, excitement bubbled in his chest like a shaken bottle of soda. This was his first time flying first class. It wasn't something he had ever expected or even dreamed about. First class was a world of luxury, a place reserved for the ultra-rich, for men in pressed suits and women with designer handbags. It was a space he had seen only in passing glimpses, separated by the sleek curtains that divided the plane's cabins. But today, it was his seat, his experience, his reward, and it meant more to him than just extra legroom or gourmet meals. It was a symbol of everything he had worked for. Eliot had spent the last 4 years buried in his studies, pushing himself harder than most. Late nights, early mornings, textbooks filled with scribbled notes, and a quiet determination that burned inside him. His mother, Alana, had always told him that education was his key, his way forward, and he had taken those words to heart. And now, after years of relentless effort, he had been accepted to one of the top universities in the country, a place that would shape his future in ways he couldn't yet imagine. His father, Thomas Hayes, had always been a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. A self-made businessman, he had built his aviation company from nothing, transforming it into one of the most respected airlines in the world. He had known struggle, had walked the hard road of rejection and failure, but he had never let it define him. And he had taught Eliot the same. When Thomas handed Eliot the first-class ticket, he had simply said, "You earned this. Enjoy it." Eliot had smiled, nodding, but deep down, a part of him hesitated. He didn't like flaunting his father's success, didn't want people to see him and assume he had been handed everything in life. He wanted to be known for his own accomplishments, not just as Thomas Hayes' son. It was why he never spoke about his father's business at school, why he had spent years proving himself on his own merits. Still, this ticket, it was different. It wasn't a handout. It was a milestone. It was his father's quiet way of saying, "I see you. I'm proud of you." As Eliot stood in line at the check-in counter, he could feel the weight of his emotions pressing against his ribs. Excitement, nervousness, a strange sense of disbelief. He had spent so long pushing forward, chasing the next goal, that he had never really stopped to acknowledge how far he had come. But today, he allowed himself that moment. The airline employee scanned his ticket and smiled. "First class, nice. Enjoy your flight." Eliot nodded, murmuring a polite, "Thank you," before heading toward security. Walking through the airport, he observed the travelers around him. Businessmen tapping away on laptops, families juggling strollers and restless toddlers, solo travelers lost in their own thoughts. He wondered about their destinations, their reasons for travel. Some looked tired, others eager, some simply going through the motions. For him, this flight wasn't just about reaching a place. It was about everything it represented. After passing through security, Eliot made his way to the first-class lounge. As soon as he stepped inside, he felt the shift. The space was quieter, more refined, with plush leather seats and the soft hum of jazz music playing in the background. A neatly dressed woman at the counter greeted him with a smile, offering him a selection of drinks. He chose hot chocolate. It was a simple choice, one that reminded him of home, of cold winter mornings when his mother would make him a steaming mug before he buried himself in schoolwork. As he took a sip, he pulled out his phone and texted his father, "I'm about to board the plane. Dad, hope to see you soon." The reply came almost instantly. "Enjoy your trip, son. I'll be waiting for you." Eliot smiled faintly. Home. It was more than just a place. It was warmth. It was laughter echoing through the kitchen. It was his father's steady presence. His mother's comforting words. It was knowing that no matter how far he went, he always had a place to return to. He set his phone down and exhaled, allowing himself to sink into the chair. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't thinking about the next step, the next challenge. He was simply here, in this moment, letting himself feel the weight of it all. As the boarding announcement rang through the lounge, Eliot stood, adjusting the strap of his backpack. He grabbed his suitcase and made his way toward the gate, his heart pounding slightly. This was it, the moment he stepped onto that plane. He was stepping into a new chapter, one that he had written with his own perseverance, his own strength. But what Eliot didn't know, what he couldn't possibly anticipate, was that this flight would be far from smooth. That the moment he handed over his ticket, his presence in first class would be questioned. That a woman in a neatly pressed uniform would look at him, not with welcome, but with doubt. And that, despite all he had achieved, he would still have to prove he belonged. Isabel Carter had always prided herself on being a consummate professional. With nearly 2 decades in the airline industry, she had cultivated an image of unwavering efficiency, poise, and authority. She wasn't just a flight attendant, she was the head flight attendant. She dictated the rhythm of the first-class cabin, set the standard for service, and ensured that everything ran smoothly. To her, first class was a realm of quiet sophistication, a place reserved for those who belonged, and she had long ago decided exactly what kind of people fit that mold. So, when she saw him, a young black boy with simple clothes, a worn backpack slung over his shoulder, and not even a hint of the arrogance or wealth she expected from first-class passengers, her well-manicured fingers instinctively tightened around the tablet in her hands. Her sharp blue eyes swept over him, narrowing slightly. He walked with too much ease, too much confidence for someone who, in her mind, had no right to be here. First class really is accessible to anyone these days, she murmured to her colleague, just loud enough for the words to land where she wanted them to. The younger flight attendant beside her hesitated, casting a glance at the boy, Eliot Hayes, before quickly looking back down, pretending not to have heard. But Eliot heard. He had heard words like those before, felt the weight of judgment in glances that lingered a second too long, seen the doubt in people's eyes when he occupied spaces they didn't believe he should. A quiet knot of irritation formed in his stomach, but he forced himself to ignore it, to keep walking as if the words had been carried away by the soft hum of the airport. Still, Isabel kept watching. She watched as he approached the first-class check-in counter, as he presented his ticket without hesitation. She watched the agent glance at the ticket, nod, and politely gesture him toward the boarding area without a second thought. That irked her. The agent should have checked twice, should have asked something, at the very least. When it was finally time to board, Isabel took her place at the front of the first-class gate, her professional mask firmly in place. She greeted each passenger with a perfectly rehearsed smile, her voice honeyed and warm. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Lancaster. Enjoy your flight, Ms. Beaumont." But when Eliot reached her, her smile faltered. It was barely noticeable, just a flicker, but it was there. And then, in a voice that was still sweet but carried the weight of doubt, she said, "Excuse me, young man, are you sure you're at the right gate? Economy boarding is over there." Eliot blinked. For a second, the words didn't register. He had been prepared for a quiet, comfortable flight, his first real taste of first-class travel. He hadn't braced himself for this. He looked down at his ticket as if to reassure himself, then back up at her. "I have a first-class ticket," he said, his voice even. He held it up slightly, so she could see the unmistakable first class printed in bold letters. Isabel's smile tightened. "Oh?" She reached out, taking the ticket from his hand, as if she hadn't heard him correctly. She examined it with the practiced scrutiny of someone searching for an inconsistency. Something, anything, that would justify her instincts. Nothing. The ticket was real. But that didn't change what she felt. This isn't right. He doesn't belong here. Instead of apologizing or simply handing the ticket back, Isabel tilted her head slightly, her voice adopting an exaggerated politeness that barely masked the condescension dripping from each word. "There might be a mistake in the system," she said. "First class isn't usually for." She hesitated, then chose her words carefully. "Students." She watched for a reaction, expecting discomfort, embarrassment, submission. But Eliot didn't shrink. Instead, he met her gaze evenly. There's no mistake. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The tension between them was like a taut wire, ready to snap. Then, Isabel smiled again, sharp. Artificial. One moment, she said, turning toward the check-in counter. She leaned down, whispering something to another flight attendant while glancing over her shoulder at Eliot. He heard snippets. Check again. This can't be right. First class? The other attendant hesitated but did as she was told, typing away at the computer. And then, a few moments later, she nodded. The ticket is valid. Isabel's lips pressed into a thin line. She could feel the eyes of other passengers on her now, watching. Waiting. If she continued to push, it would look bad. She needed to make this his problem, not hers. All right, she said at last, handing him his ticket. Enjoy your flight. But there was no warmth in her tone. No sincerity. Just the lingering echo of doubt. Eliot took his ticket without another word and stepped onto the plane. The moment he was out of sight, Isabel exhaled sharply, shaking her head as if she had just witnessed something absurd. He must be some rich man's son, she thought bitterly. That's the only explanation. As she made her way into the cabin, she found herself unable to let it go. She kept glancing toward Eliot as he settled into his seat, as he placed his backpack beside him and calmly pulled out a book. She watched the way he didn't hesitate, didn't act like he knew he was out of place. And that made her want to prove that he was. Because to Isabel, first class wasn't just a seating arrangement, it was a statement. A separation of who mattered and who didn't. And Eliot, with his quiet defiance, had disrupted that separation in a way she wasn't willing to accept. So, she made a silent decision. She would watch him, she would wait, and if there was any reason, to prove that he didn't belong, she would seize it. Because in Isabel Carter's world, order mattered, rules mattered, and whether Eliot realized it or not, he had just become her next problem to fix. Eliot Hayes had experienced moments like this before, small, sharp instances of doubt cast in his direction, glances that lingered a second too long, questions asked in tones that felt more like accusations. But this moment, standing at the entrance of the first-class cabin with Isabel Carter's cold, scrutinizing gaze locked onto him, felt different. It wasn't just a question of whether he belonged in a seat. It was a challenge, an unspoken test. As she handed back his ticket with forced politeness, her lips curving into a tight, insincere smile, Eliot could feel the weight of the moment pressing on him. He didn't want to make a scene. He never did. He wasn't the kind of person who sought out confrontation. His parents had taught him to stay calm, to never let his emotions get the best of him in situations like this. But he also wasn't the kind of person to let himself be pushed aside. He adjusted the strap of his backpack, took a deep breath, and said, "I belong here." Isabel's smile didn't falter, but something shifted in her eyes, an almost imperceptible flicker of annoyance, of disbelief. "Of course," she said smoothly, tilting her head. "You're welcome to your seat." But Eliot knew those words weren't meant for him. They were for the onlookers. For the well-dressed passengers already seated in first class who had begun to watch the interaction with mild curiosity. He could feel their gazes. Some indifferent, some questioning, a few even amused. They were waiting to see if he would back down. If he would hesitate. But he didn't. With steady steps, he moved past Isabel and into the cabin, scanning the seat numbers until he reached his own. A window seat, near the front. He exhaled quietly and placed his backpack on the floor, carefully stowing it under the seat in front of him. He wasn't about to give anyone another reason to question why he was here. As he settled in, he could feel the tension still lingering in the air, like an invisible thread connecting him to Isabel, to the passengers who had witnessed the exchange. He turned his attention to the window, willing himself to focus on the view, on the excitement he had felt just hours ago about this trip. But Isabel wasn't done. She had retreated momentarily, stepping toward the galley where another flight attendant, a younger woman named Rachel, was adjusting a tray of pre-departure drinks. Isabel leaned in, lowering her voice just enough that it carried only between the two of them. "Did you see that?" she murmured, shaking her head slightly. "First class isn't what it used to be." Rachel hesitated, her hands stilling for a moment before she forced a small smile. She didn't respond. She had learned a long time ago that silence was safer. Isabel, however, wasn't looking for a reply. She was already turning back toward the cabin, her mind spinning, searching for a justification, any justification, to validate the unease she felt. She wouldn't do anything outright. No, she was smarter than that. But she would watch him. The first real opportunity came when she began offering pre-departure beverages. She moved through the cabin smoothly, her voice warm and inviting as she addressed the other passengers. "Champagne for you, sir? Sparkling water, ma'am?" When she reached Eliot, she hesitated for just a fraction of a second before leaning down slightly. "Would you like something?" she asked, her voice just a bit cooler than before. Eliot looked up at her. "Orange juice, please." Isabel nodded, but instead of reaching for the orange juice like she had done seamlessly for the other passengers, she took her time. She turned, moved to the beverage tray, and then reached for the glass, her fingers just a little slower, as if she were considering whether or not to give it to him at all. When she finally handed it over, her fingers brushed his ever so slightly, and for a moment, her polite mask slipped. It was in her eyes, that flicker of "you don't belong here." Eliot thanked her anyway, but the real test came shortly after takeoff. Once the plane had leveled and the flight attendants began moving through the aisles again, Isabel reappeared at Eliot's side, a small, almost smug expression on her face. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice carrying just enough authority to catch the attention of a few nearby passengers. "Could I see your ticket again?" Eliot blinked. The irritation flared instantly, but he kept his face neutral. "Why?" he asked, his tone even. Isabel folded her hands in front of her, tilting her head in a mock display of patience. "It's just a routine check," she said lightly. "I want to make sure everything is in order." Eliot hesitated for only a second before reaching into his pocket, pulling out the ticket that had already been checked multiple times. He held it up without a word. Isabel took it, scanning it slowly. She knew it was valid. She knew it, but she also knew that making him go through this, making him prove himself again, was enough to send a message. After an unnecessarily long pause, she handed it back. "Thank you," she said, her tone still syrupy, still pretending. Eliot took the ticket, slipping it back into his pocket, his jaw tightening slightly. Nearby, a few passengers exchanged glances. They weren't stupid, they saw what was happening. And Eliot saw them see it. For the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed Isabel's face. She turned without another word, retreating toward the front of the cabin, her heels clicking softly against the carpet. But she knew, she had felt the moment shift. She hadn't broken him. She had expected resistance. What she hadn't expected was for him to handle it so calmly, so completely without embarrassment. She had wanted him to falter, to shrink, to give her something, some reaction that would justify her treatment of him. But he had given her nothing. Instead, he had done what she hated most. He had stood his ground. And as Isabel walked away, her heart beat just a little faster with something she didn't fully understand yet, something close to fear. Because deep down, she knew this wasn't over. And worse, she knew she was losing control. Eliot Hayes had spent his entire life proving himself. Whether in school, in conversations, or in the smallest of interactions, he had learned that he needed to be twice as composed, twice as patient, and twice as prepared as anyone else. His parents had instilled in him the belief that excellence would shield him from doubt, that his intelligence and accomplishments would be his armor in a world where people like him were often questioned. But in this moment, sitting in the plush first-class seat he had rightfully earned, staring at the cold and unreadable expression of Isabel Carter, Eliot realized something that sent a shiver through him. Sometimes, no matter how much you prove yourself, people will still refuse to see you as worthy. The moment Isabel had walked away after demanding to check his ticket again, Eliot thought, perhaps, that would be the end of it. He had shown her his ticket. He had done everything right. The proof was in her hands, in bold ink, in the system she had sworn to uphold. But deep down, a part of him knew, she wasn't done with him yet. The feeling settled in his stomach like a heavy stone. Across the aisle, a businessman in a crisp gray suit had watched the exchange with mild interest, his fingers lazily scrolling on his phone. A few rows ahead, an older woman with diamond earrings had glanced back, her gaze flickering with something between curiosity and unease. No one had spoken, no one had intervened, but they had seen, and that was enough for the weight of the moment to hang thick in the air. Eliot tried to settle into his seat, willing himself to push the moment aside. The flight was long. His father was waiting for him. Soon, this would be nothing more than a fleeting memory, something frustrating, something unfair, but over. Until it wasn't. Isabel returned. She approached with the same quiet authority she carried like a blade. Her uniform pristine, her posture unshaken. But this time, she wasn't alone. 2 security officers flanked her, their faces impassive, their hands resting on their belts. The sight of them sent an involuntary rush of adrenaline through Eliot's veins. Not because he had done anything wrong, but because he knew that the sight of 2 men in uniform standing over him was meant to send a message. A deep, knowing silence fell over the first-class cabin. Isabel's voice was perfectly controlled, her words sharp but quiet enough that only those nearby could hear. "Sir, I'm afraid there's been an issue with your seat. We need you to come with us." Eliot's fingers curled slightly over the armrest. He forced himself to stay still, to breathe evenly. He wasn't about to let her see that she had rattled him. "What issue?" he asked, his voice steady. Isabel sighed, feigning regret. "It seems there was an error in the system. This seat isn't available to you." Lies. Eliot's heartbeat pounded in his ears. But he remained still. "That's not possible." The security officer to Isabel's right shifted slightly. "Sir, we don't want to cause a scene. Please cooperate." A scene. That was the word, wasn't it? The word that had been used so many times against people like him. The unspoken warning that if he did anything other than obey, if he raised his voice, if he refused, he would become the problem. Not Isabel. Not the injustice. Just him. Eliot swallowed hard, his fingers tightening on the armrest. And yet, despite everything, despite the fire burning under his skin, despite the weight pressing against his ribs, he asked the question he already knew the answer to. Would this be happening if I looked different? Isabel didn't flinch, but the security officers did. For a moment, there was a shift, a crack in the perfectly orchestrated performance of authority. One of the officers hesitated, glancing down at the ticket still clutched in Eliot's hand. He saw the words printed there. He knew. And yet, he said nothing, because power didn't belong to the truth. It belonged to the person who could wield it best. And in this moment, Isabel Carter was holding it in an iron grip. Eliot knew he had a choice. He could fight. He could dig his heels in, demand that they check again, refuse to move. But he also knew that resistance was exactly what they were waiting for. It was the trap Isabel had laid for him. If he fought, he would lose. If he stayed, they would make him leave. And so, he took a deep, slow breath. He looked past Isabel, past the security officers, past the judgmental stares and the averted gazes of those who knew what was happening but didn't dare to say a word. Then, without another word, he stood. And in that moment, in the quiet act of standing, he had never felt such a deep and searing anger. Because this wasn't just about a seat. It was about being seen as less than. As Eliot reached down for his backpack, his movements slow and controlled, he felt every eye in the cabin watching. Some were filled with pity, others with discomfort, but not a single one spoke for him. The walk through the narrow aisle felt longer than it should have. As he passed the rows of seats, the illusion of separation between first class and economy became clearer than ever. He could feel it in the plush carpet giving way to the standard flooring. He could hear it in the subtle shift of murmured conversations. He could see it in the way flight attendants in economy class barely spared him a glance, because here, in their eyes, he belonged. Eliot found his new seat in the cramped, overcrowded section of the plane, wedged between 2 passengers who barely acknowledged him. The air felt heavier, the seats smaller. The quiet dignity of first class replaced by a space that screamed of second-tier existence. He exhaled, pressing his back against the seat, his hands gripping his phone so tightly that his knuckles turned white. For a long moment, he simply sat there, letting the weight of the moment settle over him. And then, slowly, he pulled out his phone. He stared at the screen for a long time, his father's last message still visible. "Enjoy your trip, son. I'll be waiting for you." A hollow laugh bubbled up in his throat, but he swallowed it down. Then, his fingers moved. "Dad, they moved me to economy. They said my ticket was a mistake. I know it wasn't. I don't want to cause trouble. But this isn't fair." The message sent. He waited. Seconds passed. Then, "Read." Eliot's heart pounded as the small, singular word appeared at the bottom of his message. His father had seen it. There was no immediate reply. No comforting words. No reassurances. Just silence. But Eliot knew his father. He knew that when Thomas Hayes was silent, it wasn't because he was ignoring something. It was because he was handling it. And for the first time since stepping onto this plane, Eliot allowed himself to breathe. Because justice, though delayed, was coming. Thomas Hayes had always believed in power, not the kind that came from wealth or influence, but the kind that came from principle. It was what had guided him from the very start, from the days when he was just another nameless worker scrubbing the floors of an airline hangar, to the moment he signed the final contract that made Hayes International one of the most respected aviation companies in the world. He had built his empire on hard work, resilience, and an unshakable sense of justice. So, when he saw his son's message, a cold fury settled into his chest like a storm waiting to break. "Dad, they moved me to economy. They said my ticket was a mistake. I know it wasn't. I don't want to cause trouble. But this isn't fair." It took him only a second to process the words before his jaw clenched. His hands tightened around the sleek, glass surface of his phone. But his response was measured. He wasn't a man who lashed out. He was a man who acted. Without hesitation, he reached for the landline on his desk. His movements precise, controlled. He didn't need to scroll through contacts or search for numbers. He had direct lines to every department within his airline, including the flight captain currently piloting the plane his son was on. The moment the captain answered, his voice was calm, professional. "This is Captain Moreau." "Captain," Thomas began, his voice even, but carrying an unmistakable edge of authority. "I want you to clarify something for me immediately." There was a brief pause. "Of course, Mr. Hayes. What seems to be the issue?" "There's a passenger on your flight. Eliot Hayes, my son. He was removed from his first-class seat under the claim that there was a system error. I want you to confirm whether or not that's true." Silence. A beat too long. That was all Thomas needed to know. "I see," the captain said carefully. He was a seasoned pilot, and Thomas knew that he understood the weight of this moment. "I will investigate the situation personally." "You do that," Thomas replied. Then, after a pause, he added, "And Captain?" "Yes, sir? I want names." The line went dead. Thomas leaned back in his chair, inhaling deeply. This wasn't just about Eliot. This was about something bigger. About the principle of fairness, of dignity, of making sure that no one else, no child, no teenager, no man or woman of any color, ever had to sit in an economy seat knowing they had earned something better, just because someone had decided they didn't look like they belonged. He had spent his whole life making sure that his airline was different, that it stood for something more than just profits and luxury travel. Now, it was time to remind people of that. Aboard the flight, Captain Moreau had barely hung up before he was summoning the head flight attendant to the cockpit. Isabel Carter walked in with her usual poise, but the moment she saw the captain's expression, she hesitated. "Miss Carter," he said, keeping his voice even, "would you like to explain to me why Eliot Hayes, who holds a perfectly valid first-class ticket, was removed from his seat?" Isabel's lips parted slightly, but no words came out. For the first time that flight, she didn't have an immediate answer. Because she knew. She had always known. But now, the weight of her decision was catching up to her faster than she had anticipated. She had thought Eliot would protest more, maybe raise his voice, maybe push back just hard enough that she could paint him as disruptive. But he had done none of those things. He had simply looked her in the eye, stood his ground, and forced her to be the one responsible for the injustice she had carried out. And now? Now, she was being held accountable. Isabel started, her voice faltering. She swallowed hard. There was a discrepancy in the system. You thought wrong," the captain interrupted, his voice sharp. "I just received a direct order from the owner of this airline. Do you understand what that means?" Isabel's face drained of color. "Mr. Hayes?" she whispered. The captain nodded grimly. "Mr. Hayes." A tense silence filled the cockpit. Isabel's fingers twitched slightly at her sides. The realization was setting in now, not just that she had misjudged the wrong passenger, but that the very man she had wronged was the only son of the most powerful man in the entire airline. The storm she had created was about to consume her. Fix this, Captain Moreau said flatly. Now, the moment of reckoning. Eliot sat in his cramped economy seat, staring at his phone, waiting, and then, a shadow appeared beside him. Isabel. Her usual confidence was gone, replaced with something else, something closer to uncertainty. Maybe even fear. She knelt slightly, just enough to speak at his level. And for the first time in the entire flight, her tone had changed. Mr. Hayes, she said, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. I sincerely apologize for the misunderstanding earlier. There was a mix-up in the system. We'd like to invite you back to your original seat in first class. With our sincerest apologies for the inconvenience. Eliot didn't move, didn't react, didn't blink. He just looked at her. And that, somehow, was worse than anything else. Because Isabel could see, clear as day, that he knew that this wasn't about a system error. Knew that this wasn't about an accident. Knew that she had looked at him, judged him, and decided he didn't belong. And now, she was being forced to undo it. Eliot tilted his head slightly, exhaling through his nose, before speaking in the same calm voice he had used when she had first questioned him. No, thank you. The words were so soft, so simple, yet they landed like a hammer. Isabel flinched. Excuse me? She whispered, as if she hadn't heard correctly. I'm fine here, Eliot repeated. You can keep the seat. And just like that, everything, the quiet power Isabel had held over this situation, crumbled. Passengers nearby were watching now. Some openly, others pretending not to but listening intently. Isabel swallowed hard, her lips parting, her pride struggling against the reality she was being forced to accept. But Eliot was done. Without another word, he turned back toward the window. And for the first time since this flight began, he smiled. If you believe Eliot shouldn't have been treated this way, comment below with words of encouragement. Let's show the world that no one should ever have to prove they belong in a space they've already earned. Small diamond comment to support Eliot. Small diamond share if you stand against discrimination. Small diamond let's make sure no one stays silent when injustice happens. Because silence only helps those who want to keep things unfair. And today, Eliot chose not to be silent. The steady hum of the airplane engines filled the silence that had taken over the first-class cabin. The tension hung in the air like a thick fog, pressing down on every passenger who had witnessed the events unfold. Conversations were hushed. Eyes flickered toward the front of the plane where Isabel Carter, the once composed and commanding head flight attendant, now stood frozen, her face drained of color. She had controlled the situation up until now, had dictated the narrative, but that control was slipping through her fingers like sand. Then, the unmistakable crackle of the PA system broke through the silence. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. A ripple of anticipation swept through the cabin. Even those who had been feigning disinterest suddenly looked up, their ears pricking at the serious tone in the captain's voice. Passengers in economy class, oblivious to the drama unfolding at the front of the plane, paused their conversations. Flight attendants, accustomed to hearing nothing but routine flight updates, exchanged uneasy glances, but no one was more still than Isabel. It has come to my attention that a situation occurred on this flight involving the unjust treatment of a first-class passenger. As the captain of this aircraft, I want to make it explicitly clear, this airline does not tolerate discrimination of any kind. Every passenger on this plane, regardless of race, gender, or background, deserves to be treated with respect and dignity. That is not up for debate. A collective exhale swept through the plane. Some passengers turned to one another, nodding in approval, while others stared straight ahead, absorbing the weight of the words. Isabel's body tensed, her hands clenching at her sides. The PA system was meant for altitude updates, turbulence warnings, not for this. Not for public humiliation. But the captain wasn't finished. The integrity of our airline is built on fairness and professionalism. That standard must be upheld by every single member of our crew. When that standard is broken, it is our duty to correct it immediately. Eliot sat in his economy seat, his fingers resting lightly against the armrest, his gaze still fixed on the small window beside him. But inside, something shifted. For the first time since he had been forced out of his first-class seat, he felt seen. This wasn't just a whispered apology, some behind-the-scenes fix meant to smooth things over. This was public acknowledgement. This was accountability. This was the truth. spoken aloud for every single person on that flight to hear. The cabin remained silent, but the energy had changed. The businessman in the gray suit who had quietly observed the exchange earlier nodded slightly. The older woman with diamond earrings, who had turned her gaze away when Eliot was removed, now sat with her lips pressed into a thin line, as if grappling with the realization that she had witnessed something wrong and done nothing. Even some of the first-class passengers who had initially ignored the situation now sat with a growing discomfort, as though hearing the captain's words forced them to reflect on their own silence. But no one felt the weight of those words more than Isabel. She could feel the stares, feel the judgment creeping into the same space where she had once held complete control. The foundation she had built, her authority, her reputation, was crumbling beneath her feet. The PA announcement had stripped away the polished uniform, the practiced smiles, the mask of professionalism she had worn for years. Now, she was exposed. Captain Moreau took a deliberate pause before delivering the final blow. To the passenger who was wronged today, on behalf of this airline, I deeply apologize. It should have never happened, and it will be addressed accordingly. We value each and every one of you. That is our responsibility, and we intend to uphold it. The PA system clicked off, and for a moment, the silence was deafening. Then, something unexpected happened. A single clap, then another, and then, like the slow rise of a wave, more hands joined in. The applause rippled through the economy section first, where passengers who had witnessed Eliot's forced removal clapped without hesitation. A few business-class travelers followed, their claps more hesitant, unsure of whether they were applauding justice or acknowledging their own complicity. And then, first class. The businessman in gray, the one who had been watching from the start, set down his phone and clapped twice, sharp, deliberate. That was all it took. The energy in the cabin shifted entirely. The murmurs turned into quiet conversations. Some passengers nodded toward Eliot, small gestures of solidarity. Others glanced at Isabel, their gazes no longer indifferent but sharp with unspoken judgment. Isabel's breath came shallow. Her heart pounded violently in her chest. But she didn't dare move. She had been named without being named, singled out. The PA announcement had made her actions undeniable, had forced every person on that flight to acknowledge what had happened. There was no hiding from it now, no rewriting the story in her favor. And then, just when she thought she couldn't bear another second of the attention, she heard it, a slow, deliberate shuffle of footsteps. And there he was, Eliot. He had risen from his economy seat and was walking toward the first-class cabin, not with arrogance, not with anger, but with the quiet confidence that had unsettled Isabel from the very beginning. He wasn't asking for permission. He wasn't seeking validation. He was simply taking back what was his. His seat, his dignity, his place. He reached his original first-class seat and sat down, adjusting his backpack beside him as though nothing had happened. He didn't gloat. He didn't smirk. He just existed, as he always had the right to. And that, more than anything else, was what made Isabel's hands tremble. Because in the end, she hadn't won. She had lost. The plane had a few more hours before it reached its destination. But Isabel already knew. This was the longest flight of her life. And when they landed, she would have to answer for everything. The airplane taxied to a stop on the runway, the soft lurch forward signaling that the long flight had finally come to an end. A voice crackled over the intercom, the captain thanking everyone for flying with them. But for the first time in airline history, nobody seemed in a hurry to disembark. The usual rustling of seat belts being unfastened, the clicking open of overhead compartments, the hurried shuffle toward the exit, none of it happened. Instead, passengers sat in an unusual silence, their gazes shifting toward the front of the aircraft where a storm was about to break. Victor Hayes stood just inside the entrance of the plane, his broad frame filling the doorway, his sharp eyes scanning the cabin with quiet authority. Dressed in a tailored black suit, his expression was unreadable, but the tension that filled the air was undeniable. Everyone knew who he was. Some had recognized him the moment he stepped aboard. Others had pieced it together when the captain's announcement had made it clear that the situation wasn't over. But no one felt the weight of that presence more than Isabel Carter. The moment her eyes met his, a cold shiver ran down her spine. She had spent the entire descent gripping the edge of her service tray, staring blankly at the floor, hoping, praying, that the damage control she had attempted before landing would be enough. She had approached Eliot after the captain's announcement, tried to coax him back into first class with a voice dipped in forced politeness. But his refusal had sent a chill through her, had unraveled the last thread of control she had over the situation. Now, standing before the owner of the airline, she knew there was nothing left to grasp onto. Victor's gaze barely lingered on her before moving past her, searching for the only person who mattered. His son. Eliot sat quietly in his seat, his fingers resting on the armrest, his posture composed despite everything he had endured. When he finally looked up and met his father's eyes, something unspoken passed between them. "Are you okay?" Eliot nodded once. Victor exhaled slowly. Then, with the kind of calm that carried the weight of 1,000 storms behind it, he turned back to the first-class cabin. His voice, when he spoke, was measured. "I would like to make something very clear." The hush in the cabin deepened, passengers hanging onto his every word. "This is not just about my son," he continued, his gaze sweeping across the faces before him. "This is about what kind of airline we are, about the kind of service we provide, about the standard we claim to uphold." Isabel's breath caught in her throat. Every passenger on this flight, no matter their age, background, or the color of their skin, deserves the same level of respect. And today, that standard was broken. A murmur rippled through the plane. Even those who had been indifferent before now shifted uncomfortably in their seats, as though being forced to acknowledge the weight of their own silence. Victor turned his gaze to Isabel. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice still calm, but now carrying an unmistakable finality. She swallowed hard, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure everyone could hear it. "You have been in this industry for a long time. You understand what it means to serve, to represent not just yourself, but the values of this airline. And yet, today, you failed to do that." The words landed like a blow. A deep, resounding kind of truth that couldn't be escaped. "You made a choice today," Victor continued. "A choice to judge someone based on nothing but your own assumptions. A choice to humiliate a passenger instead of serve them. And now, you will be held accountable for that choice." A sharp gasp came from somewhere in the first-class section. Isabel's vision blurred for a moment, panic clawing at her throat. This wasn't happening. This wasn't how this was supposed to go. "Effective immediately," Victor said. "You are suspended from duty. An internal review will follow, and the board will determine whether or not your employment with this airline will continue." For a long moment, nobody moved. Then, a single clap. Then another. And then, like a wave, applause rippled through the cabin. Not the polite, meaningless kind given at the end of a flight. This was something different. This was passengers who had sat in silence, finally voicing something they hadn't been brave enough to say before. This was justice. Isabel's hands shook at her sides. She had never once imagined that her career, her carefully curated image of professionalism, could be dismantled in a single flight. She had always believed herself untouchable, a veteran in the industry. But now, with every clap, every approving nod, every relieved expression directed toward Eliot, she understood. She had lost. Victor turned back to his son. His expression softened just slightly. And this time, when he spoke, his voice carried something quieter, something deeper. "Let's go home, son." Eliot stood, gathering his backpack, as he passed Isabel. He didn't smirk, didn't gloat. He simply met her gaze for one lingering second before walking past her. That was the moment Isabel felt it, the final, crushing weight of everything she had done. Because in the end, he had never needed to raise his voice, never needed to beg for recognition, never needed to prove that he belonged. Because the truth had always been there. And now, the whole world had seen it. A lesson for everyone. The plane emptied slowly, passengers whispering among themselves as they disembarked. Some glanced at Eliot as they passed. Small nods of acknowledgement given where none had been before. The businessman in gray, who had watched the entire flight in quiet contemplation, paused beside Eliot before stepping off the plane. "You handled yourself well," he said simply, before disappearing down the jet bridge. And then, as the last of the passengers trickled out, Isabel Carter remained standing in the now empty first-class cabin, her hands clenched into fists, her once pristine uniform feeling suffocating against her skin. For the first time in her career, she had to face something she had always ignored. Herself. The flight may have landed, but the storm it had unleashed was far from over. For Eliot Hayes, justice had been served aboard that plane, but his father, Victor Hayes, knew that this wasn't just about one flight attendant, or even one moment of discrimination. It was about a system, a culture that had silently allowed moments like this to happen in the shadows. Unchallenged, unspoken, until someone dared to stand up and say, enough. And so, Victor didn't stop at punishing Isabel Carter. He didn't settle for a quiet apology behind closed doors. He understood that real change didn't come from a single act of justice. It came from transforming the system that had allowed this injustice to happen in the first place. Within 24 hours of the flight landing, a meeting was called at the highest level of the airline's corporate headquarters. Executives, department heads, and senior staff were gathered in a conference room that suddenly felt much smaller under the weight of what was about to be addressed. The tension was suffocating, but no one spoke. And then, Victor entered, dressed in a dark navy suit. His presence alone commanded silence. He didn't sit. He didn't smile. He placed both hands on the long mahogany table and let his gaze sweep across the room, daring anyone to look away. "We failed," he began. The words hit the room like a thunderclap. Some executives shifted uncomfortably. Others kept their eyes fixed downward. But no one interrupted. This airline has spent decades building a reputation of excellence. We pride ourselves on luxury, on service, on being the best in the industry. And yet, on a flight under our name, a passenger, my son, was humiliated, degraded, and removed from the first-class seat he rightfully paid for. And it wasn't an accident. It wasn't a mistake. It was prejudice. Silence. No one dared to breathe. The truth is, Victor continued, his voice heavy with both anger and resolve, this wasn't the first time something like this happened. It was just the first time it was seen. The first time it was called out. And I refuse to let my airline be a place where discrimination goes unchecked ever again. A younger executive, barely into his 30s, hesitated before clearing his throat. "Mr. Hayes, with all due respect, we have policies in place." Victor turned his gaze to him, and the man froze mid-sentence. "Policies?" Victor repeated, his voice dangerously calm. "Tell me something. Where were those policies when my son was standing at that boarding gate being treated like a second-class citizen? Where were those policies when Isabel Carter looked at him and decided that he wasn't good enough for first class? Where were those policies when 2 security guards escorted him out of his seat? Without question, because one woman decided her authority mattered more than the truth?" No response. Victor exhaled, his grip tightening on the table's edge. "Policies mean nothing if they aren't enforced. They mean nothing if our employees don't understand them, if they don't believe in them. So, from this moment forward, we are not just going to say we stand against discrimination, we are going to prove it." He turned toward his assistant, who immediately distributed a thick stack of documents across the table. The executives glanced down, their eyes widening as they scanned the contents. "This is our new mandatory anti-discrimination and equality training," Victor announced. "Every employee, from our flight attendants to our pilots to our corporate staff, will undergo this program. No exceptions. If you refuse, you don't work here. If you fail to uphold these principles, you don't work here. I will personally oversee its implementation, and I will ensure that our passengers, our employees, and the public see the change we're making." A senior board member, an older man with salt and pepper hair, frowned slightly. This could be difficult to implement on such a large scale. Victor's lips twitched into something that was almost a smile. "But not quite. Change is always difficult," he said, "but allowing discrimination to continue unchecked is harder. Harder on the people it affects. Harder on our reputation. Harder on the future we're building. So, let me be clear. We are not having a discussion about whether we do this. We are doing this. The only discussion we'll be having is how fast we can get it done." The room fell into a stunned silence. Then, one by one, heads nodded in agreement, because no matter how inconvenient, no matter how unprecedented, they all knew this was necessary. And as the meeting concluded, as executives filed out of the room murmuring amongst themselves, Victor Hayes finally allowed himself a deep breath. This wasn't about erasing what had happened to Eliot. Nothing could change that, but it was about ensuring that no other child, no other person, ever had to experience the same humiliation under his airline's name. Because real justice didn't just punish, it prevented. A future without fear. Days turned into weeks. And soon, the airline's transformation became a movement. Employees found themselves in rigorous training sessions, facing difficult conversations, confronting uncomfortable truths about their own biases. No longer could someone say, "I didn't mean it that way," or "It wasn't my intention," and expect to be excused. Accountability became the standard. Passengers took notice, too. Travelers who had long accepted the unspoken prejudices of air travel began to see something different in the way the airline operated. They saw it in the way gate agents handled passengers, in the way flight attendants interacted with those who didn't fit the usual mold of first-class clientele. They saw it in the quiet, firm assurance that everyone belonged. And Eliot? Eliot watched it all happen with the quiet pride of someone who had stood his ground and, in doing so, had changed an entire system. But he didn't do it alone. He did it because of those who refused to stay silent. Those who shared his story. Those who stood with him. Who spoke up. Who demanded better. People like you. Because in the end, change doesn't happen because one person says, "This is wrong." Change happens when all of us say it, loudly, unapologetically, and without fear. Time has a way of unraveling the walls we build around ourselves, exposing the truths we try to bury, and forcing us to confront the people we truly are. For Claudia Carter, the woman who once held power over an entire first-class cabin, time had become a mirror, one she could no longer turn away from. It had been weeks since that fateful flight. The flight where she had made a decision based on nothing but her own ingrained prejudice. A decision that had not only cost her career but had shattered the identity she had spent years building. For nearly 2 decades, she had worn her flight attendant uniform with pride, believing herself to be a model of professionalism, a gatekeeper of order. She had convinced herself that her standards weren't based on race or status, but rather on experience, etiquette, and the way people fit in. But that day, that boy had forced her to see the cracks in her own foundation. She had expected Eliot to fight. She had expected anger, resistance, maybe even an outburst that would justify her actions. But instead, he had done something far worse. He had held his ground without ever raising his voice. He had let the truth be the only weapon he needed. And that truth had dismantled her. Claudia had spent the first few days after the flight in a haze, waiting for the inevitable, waiting for the call that would tell her she had been fired, waiting for the news that her career had ended in disgrace. When it came, the words had been as cold as she had feared. "You are suspended pending further review." Not terminated, but suspended. A small difference, but one that made all the difference in the world. It meant Victor Hayes, despite everything, was giving her a chance. But for what? To fight for her job? To beg for mercy? No. For the first time in her life, Claudia realized that what she needed wasn't forgiveness, it was understanding. She had wronged Eliot Hayes. She had humiliated him, diminished him, made him feel like he didn't belong in a space he had earned. No apology could erase that. No carefully crafted excuse would undo the damage. But maybe, just maybe, change could. The letter that changed everything. For the first time in years, Claudia sat down at her desk, stared at the blank page before her, and wrote not as a flight attendant, not as a professional trying to salvage her reputation, but as a human being confronting the weight of her own actions. Her hands trembled slightly as she began. To Mr. Hayes and Eliot, I don't expect you to read this. And if you do, I don't expect you to forgive me. I only ask that you hear me. I was wrong, not just in the way I treated Eliot that day, but in the way I have thought for years, in the way I have acted for years. I have spent so much of my career believing that I knew who belonged in first class, believing that my judgments were based on experience, not bias, but I see now that I was lying to myself. Eliot did not have to prove himself to me. He never should have. His presence was never the problem, I was. I took away his dignity because I believed I had the power to. I looked at him and made a decision without knowing anything about him. And for that, I will always be ashamed. I have lost my job. I have lost the respect of my peers. But most of all, I have lost the certainty that I am the person I once thought I was. And maybe that's what I needed. I don't write this letter to excuse myself. I write it because I know that real change doesn't come from punishment, it comes from reflection. From action. For making sure that the mistakes we make do not become the mistakes we continue to make. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I will spend every day proving that I have learned from this. Sincerely, Claudia Carter. She stared at the letter for a long time after she finished. Her breath unsteady. She had never been one to put her emotions into words. Had never been one to admit fault so openly. But this letter, it wasn't for her. It was for them. For Eliot. For Victor. For every person she had ever treated unfairly without realizing it. It was her first step toward redemption. A second chance. But not the same one. Victor Hayes had read many letters in his life, business proposals, contracts, legal documents. But this one? This was different. When he finished reading, he leaned back in his chair and let out a slow breath. Claudia Carter had been one of his airline's most respected employees. She had also been its greatest failure. But this letter, this was something he hadn't expected. A plea, not for a job, but for growth. And that was something he could work with. 2 weeks later, Claudia received a response, not from a lawyer, not from but from Victor himself. If you want to make this right, prove it. You are welcome to return. But not as you were. You will undergo the same anti-discrimination training that all employees are now required to take. You will work under supervision. You will not have authority over first-class cabins until you have demonstrated that you understand what service truly means. You will, in every sense of the word, start over. If you can accept that, then welcome back. Claudia clutched the letter, her chest tight with something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not fear, not humiliation, hope. Because for the first time in her life, she wasn't just going to be a flight attendant. She was going to be a better human being. A lesson for all of us. We often believe that the way we see the world is the way the world is. We convince ourselves that our judgments are fair, that our instincts are justified. But stories like Eliot's remind us of a deeper truth. Bias is invisible until we are forced to see it. Claudia didn't wake up one morning and decide to discriminate. It was something that had built up over time. Unnoticed, unchecked, unchallenged. And if it weren't for Eliot's quiet defiance, if it weren't for the accountability that followed, she might have continued living in that ignorance. The lesson here is simple. We must challenge ourselves before the world does. We must ask, do I make judgments without knowing the whole story? Do I treat people differently based on assumptions? Am I willing to unlearn what I have accepted as truth? Because change is not about punishment, it's about growth. And growth is a choice. What will you choose? If you believe in Eliot's strength, like this story. Small diamond. Like if you believe in fairness. Small diamond. Comment with words of support for Eliot. Small diamond. Share this story to remind others that we must challenge discrimination when we see it. Small diamond. Subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories that make a difference. Eliot's story started with injustice. But it didn't end there. Because he stood his ground. Because the truth was exposed. A system change, a person change, and maybe, just maybe, the world got a little better because of it. Will you be part of that change? Rocket.